able to behave as John had done, and they backed up their demands with the threat of overwhelming force. The part of honest broker between the king and the barons was played by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He professed to be neutral, but in fact he inclined to the barons and secretly helped them structure their demands. Finally, the terms were agreed, and on the 15th of June, 1215, the two sides met in a field near Windsor known as Runnymede. The barons, who had come fully armed, presented their demands, and King John, reluctantly and already in bad faith, granted what they wished. The agreement became known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. But in fact, it was only the most famous and ambitious of a succession of attempts, stretching back through the coronation oath of Henry I and the memories of Anglo-Saxon England to define the rights and duties of king and people. The original of Magna Carta, sealed by King John himself, has long since vanished. After all, the king had no desire to preserve the record of his own humiliation. But this, kept in Salisbury, is one of the only 4 survivors of the copies that were distributed to each county in 1215. Nowadays, the fame of Magna Carta rests on clauses like this: no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his goods or possessions, save by lawful judgment of his peers or equals, or by the law of the land. Or this one: to no one shall we sell or deny or delay justice. Provisions like these are, or have become, what we call basic human rights, and echoes of them survive in the Statute Book and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But they come a very long way down the document. At the top of the provisions that really concern the authors of the document, the bishops and the barons. The first clause states that the church in England shall be free, that is, free from royal interference, whilst the second limits the king's rights to exact death duties or fines from barons when their lands were handed over to their heirs. Magna Carta quickly became, and remained, a touchstone of liberties in the Middle Ages itself, and it also had very sharp contemporary teeth, because this clause allows the barons to use force to bring John into line if he showed any sign of backsliding from Magna Carta. It was tough stuff, and John didn't like it one bit. It seemed a total defeat, but John had one last card up his sleeve. Immediately, he appealed to his new overlord, the Pope, to have it annulled. Innocent agreed, and Magna Carta was promptly declared null and void. The barons were outraged at the king's faithlessness, and open war broke out. For the barons, it was no longer a question of restraining John, but of dethroning him. They even turned to the national enemy and invited Louis, son of the French king, to take the English throne. Louis invaded, and by the autumn of 1216 had seized much of the southeast of England, including London itself. Would England be divided? Or would there be the first violent change of dynasty since 1066? Suddenly, at this point, on the night of the 18th of October, 1216, John died. His heir was his son Henry, but Henry was only 9 years old. The child's cause looked hopeless, but with John safely out of the way, the prospect of a French succession lost its attraction for an important group of barons and bishops. Instead, they decided that the young Henry should be brought to Gloucester and crowned as quickly as possible. On the morning of the 28th of October, 1216, the impromptu coronation took place. The boy, who was a grave, handsome, golden-haired child, was brought to Gloucester Cathedral here. He wore a specially made set of little royal robes. First, he took the customary coronation oath. Then, he paid homage to the Pope's representative, the legate. Finally, and with all the traditional ceremonies, he was anointed and crowned, though the crown, in fact, was one of his mother's tiaras or hair ornaments. Bearing in mind the circumstances, it was inevitable that Henry's coronation was a bit of a makeshift affair, but it was real nonetheless. It had imbued him with the magical, mystical authority of kingship, and he never forgot the fact. Now it was up to his regents to persuade his country to accept him as king. Their first moves were not military, but propagandistic, for already there was something called public opinion, and they appealed to it by issuing a letter in the king's name, which argued that his youth meant that he'd had no part in the sins of his father.
We hear that a quarrel arose between our father and certain nobles of our kingdom. Whether the justification or not, we do not know.
Next, Henry's regents made a major political concession. They reissued Magna Carta without the clauses authorizing the use of force against the king. At a stroke, the charter was rescued from oblivion and the cause of civil war removed, and Henry universally recognized as king. For the remainder of his minority, the spirit of Magna Carta was adhered to, and the great men of the kingdom had a real say in government. Magna Carta had saved Henry's crown. It remained to be seen if he would honor the charter when he came of age. In 1232, Henry III was preparing a coup d'etat that would overthrow the men and measures that had restrained him for so long. Though he was 25, it had been difficult to persuade his nobles that he was no longer a child, that they should relinquish control. Now he was determined to be king in deed as well as king in name, and he was determined, above all, to break free from the shackles of Magna Carta. Henry was also influenced by the revived monarchy of France. He favoured French courtiers, and his greatest building project was wholly French in style. This, the Westminster Abbey that we know today, is essentially the work of Henry, though its interior is only a pale shadow of the masterpiece that he created, which glowed with red and blue and gold. Work started in 1245. It cost a fortune, employed hundreds of craftsmen, and lasted for 25 years in the most ambitious project of church building that Western Europe had yet seen. Indeed, it was so ambitious that it almost bankrupted the king and inflicted severe political damage on him. But for Henry, it was worth it, for he was building a monument to the greater glory of God and to the monarchy. Westminster Abbey was intended to be the crowning glory of Henry's vision of kingship. But it was a vision that was intensely controversial to some of his barons. For it seemed as un-English as the architecture of the abbey itself. For Henry's models of kingship were foreign, the French monarchy and the papacy, and his agents were foreign too. Henry showered power and wealth onto a close-knit circle of French relatives and favourites. Inevitably, the English barons resented it, and they were spurred on by Henry's autocratic style of kingship. They were furious with the king for his successful reassertion of royal power and his appointment of his foreign relations to high office, and they saw the two as being closely connected, claiming that Henry's foreign officials treacherously whispered to him that the king was above the law.
The barons were determined to restore the traditional English practice. They would reimpose Magna Carta, and they would devise a new machinery of government that would so tie the king's hands that neither he nor his heirs would ever be able to escape from it again.
The nobles quickly found a leader in Simon de Montfort. De Montfort was himself a Frenchman. Like so many of his compatriots, he'd been brought to England by Henry, showered with favour and given the earldom of Leicester. He'd even dared to marry the king's sister without Henry's permission. This marriage sowed the seeds of distrust between Simon and the king. Once, when the two men were out hunting together and had stopped to shelter from a thunderstorm, Henry is said to have told Simon that, much as he feared the lightning, he feared Simon more. The key to Simon's character was his past as a crusader. Crusaders see the world in simple black and white. Once Simon's enemy had been the infidel, but now it was those who supported Henry's autocratic style of monarchy. In 1258, de Montfort and 6 other leading barons swore an oath of mutual loyalty. Together, they were more than a match for the king, and they had their own distinct ideas of how England should be run. The two sides met at Oxford.
The council at Oxford drew up a revolutionary new way of governing the country that was intended to turn England into a crowned republic. And Henry, despite his high view of kingship, had no choice but to agree. The provisions of Oxford, as the new constitutional blueprint was known, looked back to Anglo-Saxon England with its tradition of a strong national community. And they also looked abroad to Germany and Italy, where new self-governing communes or city-states like Florence or Venice were appearing. The result was to leave Henry as king, but king in name only. Instead, his powers would be exercised by an elected council of 15, which in turn would answer to parliaments meeting at 3 set intervals a year. No other European country had tried such an audacious governmental experiment, and no other king had been subject to such humiliation.
The king was determined to avenge himself. The only way was force, and in 1264 the two sides confronted each other outside Lewes in East Sussex. Inspired by de Montfort's leadership and wearing the Crusader cross, his army quickly reduced the king's forces to a broken rabble.
After the battle, Henry took refuge here at Lewes Priory. And here too, he was joined by his son Edward, who'd been victorious in his sector of the battle, but had been unable to save the day for his father. Would the royalists give in, or would they try to resume the fight? To concentrate minds, Simon's troops shot off a volley of burning arrows, which set fire to the roof of the priory church. Intimidated and surrounded, Henry decided to surrender. But Simon's terms were tough. Henry had to swear once again to submit to the baronial government of the provisions of Oxford. And to make sure that he kept his word this time, he was compelled to hand over his son Edward as a hostage for his good behaviour. The King of England was now a puppet with only the trappings of kingship, as Simon, in the name of defending freedom, ruled both king and kingdom. Not even John had sunk so low.
Simon was now free to impose his own vision of monarchy on Henry. The king was reduced to a mere figurehead, whilst all power was exercised by Simon's baronial clique, who claimed to be acting in the name of the whole community of England.